Okay, good evening everyone, and thank you all for coming. I don't have a microphone this evening, so just checking that everybody can hear me, otherwise I'll just shout at you, so put your hand up if you can't hear. I don't think that when Kelly and I were planning the date and time for this talk, either of us realised that it would start on the dark of the moon, which is where we are this evening. And not only that, but in about 40 minutes' time, we will have a new moon. But it won't be any old new moon, if you get my meaning. It will be a very special new moon because it's also a solar eclipse. In some parts, visible in some parts of the world, but its effects may be felt overall, really. So here we are at a dark moon with a new moon about to break in the course of the talk, but it will be eclipsed, so it won't be visible in many places of the world. So a very appropriate time, really, to be exploring the other world. And looking at places between the realms. Much of what I've got to talk about this evening is from my book, Between the Realms. I'm sure it's familiar to many of you. I know that some of you have it already. If anybody wants a copy at the end, please see Kelly, because she has some copies out there to sell. Okay, encountering the other world. Let's start with a legend that was prevalent around the area of Bodmin Moor. And this legend talked about a barrow near the hurlers, stone circles. The barrow is called Rilliton Barrow. And there was a very strong legend attached to this barrow. And the legend spoke of a druid living there and guarding the barrow. The druid had a staff, a bronze dagger, and a gold cup. And the legend spoke of a huntsman who passed by to this barrow, and the druid would offer them to drink out of the cup for refreshment. And they would drink out of the cup and hand it back to the druid. One day a huntsman arrived, and being a greedy sort of fellow, was determined to drink the barrow, to drink the gold cup absolutely dry and to empty it. And so he did. Well, he tried to, and he kept drinking and drinking and drinking, but it was a magic gold cup. And he found that he was unable to actually empty the gold cup. Cursing, he got off on his horse, went off, and because probably he wasn't watching where he was going, or perhaps because he was half pissed from drinking out of the gold cup, he tumbles over a cliff and perishes. Now, the interesting thing about this legend is not only that it features a druid who was supposed to be the holders of all ancient wisdom and lore and magic, but that the Rilliton Barrow itself was excavated in 1818, and when they excavated it, what did they find but the skeleton of a man, a bronze dagger, and a gold cup. Now, the story was probably circulating in the area before the barrow was excavated. How long, we don't know, which is the thing with folklore. But as we'll see in this talk, I think folklore is really important, because not only are they usually interesting stories, which we can never date, we don't know how far back they go, but that if we scratch the surface of them, we find that they tell us something quite important about the sites where they were found and about the knowledge and beliefs of the people. They may go back dozens of years before they're recorded. They may go back hundreds of years. They may even, it's possible, go back thousands of years and be indications of the beliefs of some of the people who actually built the sites. So the Rillaton Gold Cup story is an interesting one because it's got confirmation, if you like, through the excavations which actually found the gold cup itself, which is in the British Museum, with a replica in the Royal Cornwall Museum at Truro. So when we look at some of these ancient sites and look at the stories surrounding them, they are one way for us to get a glimpse, perhaps, to the ancient belief systems of the people who built these sites, or later the people who used the sites and thought certain things about them, attributed certain stories to them. This, as I'm sure you all know, is the Merry Maiden stone circle down near Ramona. And like many stone circles, it has stories attached to it. The Rillaton Barrow was near the Hurler stone circle. And the story there is of men hurling, playing the game of hurling, which is a particular Celtic game, or at least is found in Celtic countries, especially Ireland. This hurling stones story attached to the Hurler stone circle shows that the men were playing hurling on the Sunday and were turned to stone. And two of the stones, the outliers to the Hurler stone circle, are supposed to be then petrified. Very similar story applies to the Merry Maidens and some other stone circles as well. The story, which I'm sure many of you know, is that women were dancing, maidens were dancing at this site, and on a Saturday evening, and they continued dancing inadvertently into the Sunday. And of course it was forbidden that any such thing as dancing would take place on a Sunday. Now this is obviously a story that comes from Christianity, probably dates back to Victorian times, but interestingly it may tell of something of the meaning of the circle. Very many stone circles in West Cornwall have 19 stones, and we have 19 here in this case. I think 19 is not a coincidence because there are 18.6 years in a standstill cycle of the moon. We're actually in one at the moment, at the end of this year and beginning of next year. It's a standstill cycle. And the moon rises at its lowest point and just hovers over the surrounding hills. Behind the Merry Maidens you can see two hills, Bartini and Chapel Carn Grey. And this particular year the moon will set very close to the top of those two hills, which must have been a very magical sight to the people who built the stone circle. So the story of the 19 maidens being turned to stone for dancing on the Sabbath may go back a long way before it was recorded in Victorian times. And it contains very interesting elements. It contains the notion of dancing at these sites. And many of the ancient sites were probably used for ritual, ceremony and dancing as part of that. Dancing has been evidenced by some archaeological investigation of some of the sites, whereby the ground penetrating radar has picked up traces of the disturbance of the soil, indicative of people dancing at the site. And you know, this may be from more recent times. People still dance around these places nowadays, but it may also, because it's in the subsoil, go back much earlier than that. There may be evidence of the fact that people did use these places for dancing and ceremony. The two standing stones as outliers of this circle, called the pipers, were in the legend pipers that played their music on Sunday. And the fact that they were turned to stone on the Sunday may be a folk memory of the fact that these were sacred places in prehistoric times, and that the whole story of them dancing on the Sabbath may be a memory of how the sites were used. Perhaps they were used by 19 priestesses of the goddess, and perhaps people did come to these places and have ceremony and ritual, part of which was the dancing. Interestingly, the story doesn't stand alone by itself. I mean, I mentioned that there may be a reason for the 19 maidens. Another reason might be the metonic cycle, which is the alignment of the sun and the moon in the sky, and it takes exactly 19 years to get to the same place in relationship to it. Perhaps the 19 stones are an acknowledgement of that, and perhaps that's encapsulated in this folklore legend. But nearby to the Merry Maidens, some possibly 1500, 2000 years later, in the Celtic Iron Age period, is Fugu, which is an underground passage built at that time. And nobody knows for certain what Fugus were used for. Some people thought that it was used for storage, but in fact it's not a very good thing. It was too damp for storage. You could store dairy products, but it seems a huge undertaking to build one of these passage chambers, store half a pound of butter. And other people said that it was used perhaps for refuge. Well, there are similar structures in Ireland, Wales and Brittany called souterrains, and we do know that they were used for refuge. But they're very different to fugus, actually. There are hidden passages in souterrains and false doorways and places that certainly could be used for storage, for refuge. But you wouldn't be able to use fugus very well for refuge because you'd be trapped inside. And once the enemy had discovered you were in there, you could easily be smoked out or burnt alive or whatever. But this interesting thing about this fugu, which is not very far within walking distance of Merry Maidens, is it has a similar story, similar folklore attached to it. In the story of Duffy and the Devil, the protagonist in the story is chasing a hare, and the hare goes down into the fugu, and he follows the hare into the fugu, and there he discovers a whole bunch of women in a circle, and they are invoking the devil. Now, the devil, as we know, was only the Christian overlay for the pagan religion. So you have here another story of a bunch of women gathered in a circle. They may have been dancing, or they may have been chanting, or they may have been invoking, but they were doing something that connected them to the other world. And it is this use of these ancient sites as a medium, method of contacting the other world, which is really the significant thing. Other sites we have down here have similar legends. This is Balwell Barrow, Carn Blues, near St Just, familiar I'm sure to lots of you. What's maybe not so familiar is this had a story attached to it of the fairy folk, and lights could be seen at night around this site, which manifested as circles of fairies dancing around the barrow itself. So we're beginning to open up into the nature of the other world. They're associated with supernatural occurrences, such as the women down the Blade Fugu. They're associated with some kind of ancient ceremony and ritual, as at the Merry Maidens. They're associated with the little people, the fairies, or in Cornwall they were known as piskies. So many of these sites have these legends which seem to place them both in the material world, because they functioned as burial chambers or enclosures or ritual places, but they also exist in another world, another dimension. And that world is the other realm, which was so familiar to Celtic people. And we see it in the legends of Ireland, and Scotland, and Wales, and Brittany, and Cornwall has similar legends as well. From some of these sites we can infer what their use might have been. This is Strathebe Coit on Bobbing Moor, and a very interesting dolmen. I mean, some dolmens down here in West Penwith, like Tune and Mulfra, have cut marks on the topstone of the dolmen. And we know that cut marks were actually deliberately used for making offerings, libations to the dead. There are many sites in Brittany, particularly, where people used to go to pour offerings of milk and honey to the dead. And this particular one, Strathebe Coit's, always interested me because it has a hole in the top of the capstone. It's been discovered that the midday sun, and only the midday sun at midday, shines through that hole at the time of the midsummer solstice. It doesn't do it on any other time throughout the course of the year. And in the bottom right, as you can see, there's this cutaway area as well. And it's been suggested that that was deliberately cut away because the remains of the dead were interred inside the dolmen, but their spirit needed to be allowed to escape. And it's been suggested that this cutaway was the means whereby the spirit of the dead placed inside could escape and go into the afterlife. So all these sites have interesting links with the deposition of the dead and connection to the spirits. The world of the living and the world of the dead were not two separate worlds to the Neolithic and Bronze Age pupils. They were different aspects of the world in which we live. And the other world was very close to them. They were very aware of it during their everyday practices. And our notion of us living in the real world and perhaps passing to another world, which is common in many religions, Christianity and Buddhism and all sorts, is of the spirit passing into another world. Well, they may have had a similar belief system, and they may have thought that the spirits left the body and travelled to another world. I'll say a little bit more about this in a minute. It's worth looking also at some of the stone circles. This is, I'm sure you know, Boscanoon stone circle, and the stone right in the foreground, out of 19 stones, 19 again, we have one, this one, which is made almost completely of quartz. Now, you know, you may think, okay, quartz looked nice to them, they brought this quartz stone from somewhere and deposited it in the circle. But quartz was a very significant material, mineral, to the Neolithic and Bronze Age people that built these sites. Wherever we travel through Ireland, we've been recently to the Isle of Man, and in Brittany, quartz is deliberately chosen as a particular material to be used in stone circle building. We have a fine example of that here in Cornwall at the Dulo stone circle, which is up near Loo. This has 8 stones, one at each of the cardinal points, so north, south, east, west, northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest, which may mark the different points in a wheel of the year, which may have been part of their belief system. But the thing that stands out very much at this site, and it must have been more so when it was constructed 5,000 years ago, is that each of the stones is made of quartz. Now they must have found a seam of quartz somewhere near. Suggestions have been made as to where that could have been. Cut and dragged the stones and erected them here, and they are all made of quartz. And there is something very special about quartz. At Boscanoon, that we looked at just now, the quartz stone is often thought of as a healing stone, known as the mother stone of the circle. And there have been attested accounts of people having received healing from this stone by touching it. And I mean, one of the other things that's been discovered about stone circles is that quartz has a piezoelectric effect. And some dowsers, particularly Hamish Miller, came to this site and touching this quartz stone got a tingle off it. It was strong enough to sort of throw him back from the stone. And this is a known phenomenon, a piezoelectric effect, whereby some static electricity is generated by the quartz. So in some way, these stones may have been seen to be alive and living stones, and they may also have been seen as, by touching them or doing ritual with them, as a way of reaching the other world through the stone itself. We've seen examples, particularly from burial sites. There's one here in Cornwall that was found when they excavated Trefellum Farm up near Newquay, and its excavator, Jackie Nowakowski, told me, which I don't think is published anywhere, but she said that in the barrows and graves and the cists that they found at Trefellum Farm, pieces of quartz, small pieces of quartz, have been deliberately brought there and placed into the entrance graves. So we've come across this in other places as well. On the Isle of Man, there's an entrance grave there where the whole grave was made out of quartz stones. It's like entering a crystal cave inside there. Quite an amazing place. So they deliberately brought the quartz in order to construct the entrance grave as a place of the dead. So we just need to be alert to things like this, I think, when we visit some of these sites. Oh look, there are quartz stones here. Why are there quartz stones? Why were they brought here? Well, it may be something to do with communion of the lost world of the dead. Going back to dolmens or quoits, as they're known in Cornwall. This is Tune Quoit, and it's interesting to note that these quoits were the first monuments to be built after the people had settled at the end of the Mesolithic period, and they started to rear animals and plant crops. And they had more time on their hands. They weren't moving around the land in search of game like they were in the Paleolithic and the Mesolithic. And they started to deposit the dead in the local area near where they were living. And all these quoits are probably connected to living places, the living places in the valleys below and the quoits on the hillsides and the hilltops. And although there are very few remains at the quoits in Cornwall, because we have a very acid soil, so any bone matter is lost. Nevertheless, in other parts of the country that also have dolmens, such as Wales, they have found remains inside the quoits. And the interesting thing is, with modern dating techniques and modern DNA research, is that they discovered that it's not one individual who's normally buried in these dolmens, it's a collection of individuals. So it's obviously a tribal thing. It's not one man or one woman, but it's the collective consciousness of the tribe that's buried. Also, they found that very often parts of bodies would be buried in these places, and sometimes parts would be removed and other parts put in place, which to me is absolutely fascinating. It has something to do with the belief system, I think, of the collectiveness of the tribe, that they are all part of the same unit, and after death they share a tribal place where they're buried. They're not individual monuments, they're not graves as in later periods. These are places where perhaps important people in the tribe were buried, but also removed, and other important people put in their place. And I think that when we go back far enough, we go back to the time when these were built in the Neolithic, we know from contemporary tribes that are living Stone Age lifestyles, although increasingly there are very few left in the world now, but when they were visited and recorded, it was usually found that the spiritual leader of the tribe, or spiritual person that facilitated an encounter with the other world, was a shaman, or sometimes, if it's a woman, it's called shamanka. Now, the word shaman comes from Siberian tribes, and it really only applies to them. But other tribes in other parts of the world also had these spiritual leaders, used to be called medicine men, whose job it was to intercede between the world of the dead and the world of the living. And I'd like to think that these were places that these shamans would have come in order to connect with the world of the dead and the spirits of the dead. Now, this may not be for any deep mystical reason, it could be something incredibly practical, like cattle in the tribe were sick, and what do we do about it? How do we cure them? Or somebody who is important in the tribe may be ill or sick, and what are the herbs I should use in order to try and make them well again? But they may have come to places like this where we know that the remains of the dead of the tribe were buried, who would have been thought of as the wise people of the tribe, because they lived longer, many of them. And they would have communed with the spirits of the dead of these people in order to gain answers to practical problems that were affecting the tribe. So these are very special places, but they're not tombs in the way that we would think of tombs today. They are collective places where people could go to connect with the spirits of the dead. It was felt that the dead were very close to the living. And if the dead occupied the other world, together with the fairies and the piskies, they did so with the spirits of the dead. There were many denizens who lived in this alternative world that was so close to ours, which we could reach at certain times and in circumstances. So the shamans from this Neolithic period may have gone to places like this in order to connect with the spirits of the other world. At a later time, in the Celtic Iron Age, we have these fugus, which, if they too were places of the spirits, although because fugus are unique to West Cornwall and because bodies don't last very long in our soil, we haven't actually found anything there. But I think we can imagine that the Druids who came from the Celtic tribes were the spiritual descendants of the shamans from the Neolithic period. They performed the same function for their tribe. They were repositories of wisdom about the past, and they may have gone to places like this one, in order for a spiritual encounter with the ancestors. What evidence do I have for this? Well, we can never be certain about any of this. It's speculation, but it's speculation based on evidence that's been gleaned through archaeology and comparative anthropology. And archaeology in particular at this site it tells us something interesting. It tells us that both ends of the fugu, which are now open, were originally closed off. And the only way into the fugu was by a very small creek passage, which is down towards the end of the fugu. Now shut off by English Heritage because they say it's dangerous. But you can still see it if you go down into the fugu. And it may well have been, as I imagine it, that this fugu was aligned to the rising sun. This is Ian Cook's research, at the midsummer solstice sunrise. And all the long passages, north-easterly passages of the fugus are all similarly aligned to the rising sun at the midsummer solstice. Now, putting all this together, the idea that I came up with was that both ends of the fugu are shut off, but there are movable stones in the entrance of the fugu. And there is evidence for this, something similar, back in Newgrange in Ireland, where at the midwinter solstice sunrise, a light shines in through a roof box and illuminates the passage and the chamber at the end with a carved stone. And I can imagine, none of us know for sure, but I can imagine this site being sealed off both ends on maybe the night before the summer solstice, into the fugu, through the creek passage, which you have to get in down on your hands and knees, would come the druids perhaps. Perhaps it was the spiritual initiates of the tribe. Perhaps it was the adolescents that were just about to have their initiation as part of their life cycle, as part of that tribe. And while they were in the dark, by means that are known to most of us, they attain altered states of consciousness, perhaps by fasting, perhaps by prolonged drumming all night, perhaps by the ingestion of psychotropic plants, because most tribes living Stone Age lifestyles do use any local psychotropic plants in order to attain altered states of consciousness. In Mexico they use the peyote plant. In parts of Brazil and other South American countries they use ayahuasca. And you know, the question is, well, would they have used anything here? Do we have anything? Well, we do. We have magic mushrooms. Magic mushrooms contain psychobilin, which is a narcotic inducing drug, which does cause altered states of consciousness. So it's quite possible they would have picked magic mushrooms or other plants, maybe no longer there, and used them in these rituals in order to attain states of consciousness. Now they're not recreational drug trips. These are things that are done specifically in order to attain a spiritual state of altered consciousness, whereby you can enter the alternative realms and you can speak with the spirits of the dead. They may have done this at the midsummer solstice. They may have attained that state of altered consciousness, and the moment the sun rises over the neighbouring hill, someone may have opened the movable stone at the front of the fugu and let the first rays of the birthing sun enter. Because the sun was probably not seen as a static object, or neither the moon. They were seen as gods and goddesses as part of the belief of the tribe. And their reviving power at the summer solstice and the winter solstice, and some of the equinoxes and the cross-quarter days, may have been seen as bringing life back into the people of the tribe. Or they may have been used for, as I said earlier, the spirits of the dead to be able to escape. Many mythologies worldwide have stories whereby all human life came from a planet or a star. The Pleiades star system was particularly known about in many cultures, and it was thought that life came from the Pleiades to Earth, and after death the spirits of the dead return to the Pleiades. So it may have been linked into their belief systems about life and death, about attaining an altered state of consciousness, and about what happens to you after you die, and what happens to your spirit after you die. Other Fugus have similar stories attached to them, and although we can never be certain with any of these things, it seems to many of us, including nowadays archaeologists down here in Cornwall, that these were places of ritual and ceremony and for connection with the dead. They weren't simple, practical places, but storing milk and butter or seeking refuge. We find the same in other countries as well. This beautiful dolmen is in Wales. It's called Pentry Ifan. It's an interesting one because the capstone mirrors the nearby mountain, and we can't be certain whether these sites were enclosed. Some people think they were enclosed up to the capstone, but the inside of the dolmen was still accessible. Well, if you think that people were buried in there and bits of body taken out and other bits added in, they must have been accessible inside in some way. But again, going back to legends, the legend of this particular site is known as Ceryl's Cauldron. And Ceridwen was the Welsh goddess of the underworld. Very interesting story, which I haven't got time to go into here, but Cerylwen has an interesting backstory. But she also has an inexhaustible cauldron, which never empties. Shades here of the story of the Druid and on probably more religion. But Ceryl's Cauldron has this, Pentry Ifan has the story of Ceryl's Cauldron. She is was buried in the centre of this dolmen with her inexhaustible cauldron. And we know from Celtic times, by Celtic I mean Romano-Celtic period, into the Iron Age, Romano-Celtic, that peoples all over the Celtic lands, including Cornwall, deposited offerings to the denizens of the other world. Very often in watery places, such as lakes. In particular, there's evidence of some offerings being found at Lake Barla in Wales and Loch Gur in Ireland. In both places, evidence of swords and metal objects and precious objects belonging to individuals within the tribe have been cast into the waters as offerings to the goddesses and gods of the other world. These places were thought of as access places to the other world. You could get to the other world through entering the lakes, rivers, streams and so on. And quite a few offerings have been found at these places. The other type of place is high places, holy hilltops. This is Traincrom Hill, nearby here. And Traincrom Hill has an interesting legend. It was the realm of the goddess Tregoban, but there was a whole troop of Cornish piskies, or spriggans, as they were known locally, who guarded the treasure of these places. Now, we don't know what the treasure was, but Cornwall was actually not marginal in prehistory. Cornwall was quite central. Cornish green axes were very much prized in the Neolithic and have been found at sites all over the country, including Stonehenge. Of course, by the time we get to the Iron Age in the Romano-Celtic period, it's tin that's so prized here in Cornwall. Cornwall was one of the few sources of tin throughout Europe and the world. And the Bronze Age itself would not have happened without Cornish tin. Cornish tin was traded for other things, so it was comparatively rich. It was quite well known, and it was very much valued as a source of tin. It was tin and copper together that make the bronze. So we have the notion here of there being a treasure, which may have been the tin or something else, guarded by these beings from the other world, these piskies or spriggans. And a number of tales have grown up about this. I'm just going to read a little bit about piskies and spriggans, not only from Cornwall but from other places, because I don't always remember all the different sites. Many of the legends and stories of fairy folk that are common to all Celtic countries, Ireland, Cornwall, Wales, Isle of Man, Scotland and Brittany, contain elements that hint of the ancient significance of the genius loci or spirit of place. To our early ancestors, many of the places of the land were infused with the spirit of that land, and what to us may appear to be inanimate objects, such as stones, rocks and trees, were the embodiment and living place of the spirits of the earth, in ancient times the goddess herself. For example, in Ireland and Scotland, the little people were known to inhabit certain places, usually ancient hilltops, fairy knolls and prehistoric earthworks. This is reflected in the names of some Irish places, such as Mullach na Shee, which means the fairy land, or Slieve Gullion, which means the enchanted mountain. In the recent remapping of Ireland by the Irish Ordnance Survey, some 30,000 such sites have been identified. In the Isle of Man there were many such fairy glens. Indeed, there was hardly a glen or hollowed area that was not their haunt. Their memory remains in some of the place names. Cronk na Shee, the hill of the fairy, and Glion na Shee, the glen of the fairy. Glen Shee in Scotland, it's the same word. Wales too has its fairy glens at Betsy Cwyd and Penmaen Mor, which lies near the Bronze Age Druid Circle. The dolmen of Pentry Eben that we just looked at was known to be the haunt of fairies. And on Skye, fairies dance on moonlit nights. And we remember here Carn Blues that we looked at earlier, a Ballywog where the fairies danced. In Cornwall, the name Piskie has been applied to both natural features such as Piskies Cove near Mount Spain, Piskie Fields in Madron, and the land, and megalithic structures such as Piskie Hall, Fugu, and Constantine. The Piskies and Spriggans were thought to inhabit the old ruins and megaliths, as well as the high places, and this could perhaps be a folk memory of the small statured Neolithic people who built them. Very often the places of fairy are the sacred places of the ancestors. Corroy Church on Skye is built on the site of a prehistoric burial mound, but below it was thought to be fairy ground, and their songs could be heard rising through the earth. In Ireland there were two such places. One was at Tara, the magical and sacred centre of the island, and Evans Wens noted, on the ancient hill of Tara, from whose heights the high kings once ruled all Ireland, from where the sacred fires in pagan days announced the annual resurrection of the sun, the Eastertide where the magic of Patrick prevailed over the magic of the Druids, and where the hosts of the Tuatha De Danann were wont to appear at the great feast of Samhain. Today the fairy folk of modern times hold undisputed sovereignty. So these places in the land were thought of as being the places that the creatures from the other world, piskies and the like, the fair folk could emerge. I can give a personal account of that, because once when I was over in Ireland, staying in Wexford, staying on this B&B, the farmer's wife found that we were interested in these things. She said, oh, my husband would be interested in that. Husband comes in, farmer, busy, doing things. She says to him, these people, these women, very interested in the old legends. He grunts. She said, perhaps you could show him some of the sights on our farm. So it didn't look very promising, but we got into his car and he drove us around and showed us places. And as the day rolled on, he got more and more open, more and more friendly, especially when he discovered we were from Cornwall, and we had many of the same sorts of legends as he got inherited, not from books, but passed down through generations in Ireland. And I remember we were driving down this small road, tiny road, on the way back at the end of the day, and he suddenly stopped the car, and we said, what's wrong? And he said, he looked at us and he said, just wanted to show you that this is the place where the fairies cross. Now, it was nothing to distinguish it at all. There was a gap in the hedge and a gate at the other side. And I said to him, have you seen them? Have you seen this? And he gives me another sideways look, and he said, yeah, he said, many a time. He said, and I always stop here to give my respects to the fairies because this is where they cross to go to their fairy man. So such beliefs are still alive today if you look for them, or if they arrive unbidden in your lap. And they were places that people really did believe this happened. And it seems to me that if so many people believed it, it must be that some of them saw the fairies cross at these places. You have to believe in the fairies or the piskies in order to see them. And they believed in them, and they were certain they crossed the land. Very many places in Ireland, you see, not so much nowadays, but you used to see corners of houses cut off. And it's because a ferry path ran across. And there's a notorious case, which I'm sure some of you have heard, is when they were building Shannon Airport. They had to divert the runway because the locals would not work on it. And they said it's a ferry path. We're not going to build on a ferry path. So they actually had to, if you go to Shannon Airport, the runways are at odd angles to each other. And it's because it was being built across on a ferry path. So these piskies down here, fairies, little folk in Ireland, were definitely thought of as actually inhabiting the land. And many of the stories that we have in Cornwall, which were written down in the late 17th and 18th centuries, particularly the stories of Robert Hunt, and William Bottrell, talk quite freely about the fairy folk being seen in the land. They went around and they gathered local stories by local people. And it was before the age of rationality really set in, and people certainly believed in the existence of the fairy folk. And they came from another world. They came from between the realms. And places still exist in the land today where they were recorded and seen. This, of course, is Carnkennajack near St Just. And many stories were collected here of people's encounters with the beings from the other world. At Tregursill Circle, there was one character who one night met fairy folk who tied him down with a gossamer threads, and he couldn't get free until the morning. In another story, up on Carnkennajack itself, a wrestling match was observed between some Cornish tinners and the devil. And these stories were told in good faith. They weren't told with a sense of, oh, these are fancy stories for children. They were told by people who had been told by their mothers and their mothers and their mothers. And they were believed in, and it was certainly believed that the fairy folk still existed. I think, how am I doing for time? Oh yes, I've got time for one or two of these stories. This one is a Pisky-led story, it's featured around an ancient site down here. one of the best-known piskie-led cases concerns one Uta Bosens, who was led astray as he was returning from St. Justus St. Creed one evening after a hurling match. And I think we need to get this picture up. When he got to the field at Bosens, called Park and Chapel, this is it, the site of an old Celtic chapel, a cloud of fog rose from the moors, so thick that he could scarcely see a yard in front of him. He walked towards where he knew there was an opening in the field, but when he got there, no opening was to be found. He tried to climb over the hedge, but the more he climbed, the higher the hedge became. At the ruins of the old chapel, which is this, he saw, quotes, the most frightful spirits and spriggans one ever beheld, and encountered a demonic being that sent him rolling down the field, tossed over the hedge, pushed through the brambles and furze, pitched over the bogs, and whirled away like dust before the wind. Now, the significance of this story is not only the place where it occurred, site of an old Celtic chapel, but also the time of it being Midsummer Night, the time of the old pagan festival, when bonfires were still lit on the hilltops. So we have here a doubly potent between the worlds of time and space setting for the experience to have occurred. And Bottrell and Hunt give lots of examples of this. Bottrell said, the ugliest of sprites and spriggans, with other strange apparitions, such as unearthly lights, were often seen hovering around the ruins of the old chapel. Hunt says how an old man who got piskie-led in the area would often shelter at Caerbran. This is Caerbran from the Iron Age Hillport, for everyone knew that anywhere within the rings on Brain Hill, the same as at Bartini, nothing evil that wanders the earth by night could harm them. So this was some kind of sanctuary, the whole area of Caerbran. It's a prehistoric site, obviously, but it was thought to be a refuge site from anything bad from the other world that might get you. Because these beings of the other world were not seen as pretty Victorian fairy folk. They were often quite fierce, and they could actually do quite a lot of harm and could lead you astray. Another such story tells of William Noy, who also had an encounter with the other world. The creatures who inhabit this world include the dead ancestors, but also gods, spirits, supernatural creatures, and strange beasts, and often the fairy folk. The place of the other world is also a place out of time. Time moves at a different pace, and if an ordinary mortal enters the other world, he or she does not grow any older there. However, if she or he then returns to the everyday world, time has passed, and all his or her companions have grown older. Other common elements in the Welsh and Irish stories include passage into the other world, which is often a burial mound or fairy mound, or across or underwater. Also, the time for entering the other world is often at the Celtic festivals, when the boundaries between the earthly and supernatural worlds is broken down and spirits and humans can move freely between the two lands. And there are many stories in Irish and Welsh literature telling of these things. People who have gone into the fairy mounds and have moved into the other world as a result of it. So I think we've got time for one other interesting story. And this is the story of CHERYL of Zena. The road to the other world through caves and mounds, so typical of Irish and Welsh tales, may also be found in the Cornish story of the young farmer Richard Vingo, who follows a path or underground passage on trivial cliffs, and in emerging, finds himself in a strange place-looking country that is fairyland. He is taken by a beautiful lady through palaces of most gorgeous description. It says pillars of glass supported arches which glittered with every colour, and they were hung with crystals far exceeding anything which was ever seen in the caverns of a Cornish mine. Eventually he is restored to the everyday world, and his story includes many of the elements found in Welsh and Irish annals. Beautiful music leading to the other world, a place surrounded by a lake, or at the bottom of the lake, in the beautiful state of the land itself. Although the stories of the Cornish Otherworld are never specifically described as the Otherworld, nevertheless that is what they are. In the story of Cherry of Zena, for example, there are a number of important trigger words in the story to indicate that the reader is on a journey to the other world. Cherry meets a gentleman at a crossroads, i.e. a magical place of transformation, and he takes her on a journey through lanes where sweet briars and honeysuckles perfume the air, and the reddest of ripe apples hung from the trees over the lane. The fecundity of nature, where everything grows abundantly, is always a hint that we are on the way to the other world. Then they come to a stream of water as clear as crystal, which ran across the lane, where the man carries her across, and streams and rivers are liminal places, marking the division between this world and the other world. Having crossed the stream, they arrive at a garden where everything was more intensely beautiful than anything in the everyday world. It says, flowers of every dye were around her, fruits of all kinds hung above her, and the birds, sweetest of song than any she had ever heard, burst out into a chorus of rejoicing. Cherry is then taken into a house which was yet more beautiful. Flowers of every kind grew everywhere, and the sun seemed to shine everywhere, and yet she did not see the sun. Cherry spends some time in this enchanted land, looking after the house and the master's child. But it is no ordinary place. One room contains people who have been turned to stone, and Cherry has some ointment put on her eyes, which gives her the gift of seeing the fairy folk. Eventually she returns to the, quote, real world, but is forever changed by the experience. So stories such as this, I think, are not just quaint, pretty stories. They're actually telling of the alternative world that these people so believed in. A world that was run parallel to ours, and which could be accessed through certain means at certain times. These other realms are very strange. They're like our world and yet not like our world. And they are the means of communicating and connecting with the other world. There are other places in the landscape. Obviously I haven't got time to do them all, but the Isles of Scilly were known originally as the Isles of the Dead. This is a picture from one of the barrows on the Scillies, Obadiah's barrow. And there are a huge number of entrance graves on the Scillies, far more than you would expect from the native population. So it was often thought that people who died on the Cornish mainland were shipped across to the Isles of Scilly and buried over there. So it's surprising how many stories there are that tell of places not of this world, which are places of the dead. And the other aspect that it's worth mentioning is the notion that anthropologically there were faces actually in the stones and rocks themselves. Now this is a depiction of the mermaid of Zena, I'm sure you all know, a bench carved in the church in Zena, and it's an interesting story. On one level, you think it's a great story. A mermaid was waiting in the sea off Zena, and she used to come to the church and sit at the back every Sunday. And the choir boy of the church, Matthew Truella, had the most beautiful voice, and she came to listen to him. And eventually one day after the service, she approaches him, and he agrees to go off with her, and they disappear off. And their house is built under the waves off Zena. The proof of this in the story is that a boat tries to come into Zena Harbour at one point and finds its way blocked by Matthew and the mermaid, and they have to ask her to allow them ingress into Zena Harbour. Interesting little story, bit of folklore, but once you start probing underneath the surface of it, you discover that the mermaid of Zena, and the name Zena, is based on a real name, Azinor. And Azinor is a real place. And Azinor is in Brittany. And Azinor has its own folk story. It says a princess or priestess of Azinor was cast adrift into the sea by evil Christian men, not expected to survive, but instead a boat crosses to Ireland, and she survives, and she returns to Brittany via Cornwall and via Zena, where she founds the church at Zena. So you have this church, you have this folklore story, you have this other folklore story set in Brittany, and you have this mermaid. And it's like all different levels are combined together in this story. Memories of a sea goddess, perhaps, who becomes Azinor and then becomes the mermaid of Zena. They all link together, bits of ancient story, bits of myth, bits of modern story come out in this story. And you know, our ancestors must have had their own stories that they told as well. We look at the ancient sites, we look at the stone circles and the standing stones, and all we see are the actual monuments themselves. What we don't see are the knowledge, the folklore, the legends, the wisdom of the people that built these places, who must have had these stories which they told time and time again, and they told out in the land as they moved between these sites. One site that Lana and I have been back to a number of times, taking other groups there, is this one, which absolutely fascinates me. It's the Caerdydd stone. It's in the southwest part of Ireland, and the stone itself is an erratic, which just sits in the landscape. You wouldn't think it was anything but a stone, but it's amazing. There's a huge stories built around it about the Caerdydd, who is the old crone goddess, who comes originally from the Beara Peninsula in Ireland. This is in the Beara Peninsula. And it was such a sacred stone, even in recent times, that fishermen would come to this stone and place offerings to the kayak, to the old woman, the crone, for a safe passage out to sea and a good catch before they went. And this is one of those few sites that have remained spiritually significant over the years, right up to the present day, because people still go to this place and they place offerings of flowers, fruit, shells, things that they've collected from the countryside at the stone itself. So if you visit this, very often you'll find it festooned with all sorts of offerings for good luck and good fortune from the Caerdydd. It's also opposite this beautiful breast-shaped hill, and we know that breast-shaped hills were often seen as aspects of the goddess. It's very famous Papsabanu in Ireland, where two breast-shaped hills are supposed to represent the goddess actually in the land. Now these may be hints. I know we're going back a long way, and you know, folklore, you cannot date it. It may be from more recent times, but it just seems to me that this stone has got real ancient significance. It was supposed to have been the Carcassonne. You see the shape in the rock. So that it was so strong that people continued to go to it and honour it and give it offerings. And the fact that it was opposite this breast-shaped hill, I think, is significance as well. And we have stones, rocks in Cornwall, which also people have seen shapes in. Now, it may be fanciful, but if we see something like this in a rock or a stone locally, I think it's a fair bet that our ancestors probably saw it as well. And they would perhaps build their own standing stones. They would select pieces of rock which looked to them to have significance. This is Roche Rock near St Austell, near the Clay Country. And a settlement at the foothills of Roche Rock was excavated some years ago by Andy Jones and Dick Cole, a couple of archaeologists. And they discovered that in this settlement at the foot of Roche Rock, the inhabitants, dating back to the Bronze Age, had deliberately constructed pits into which they placed sacred objects. And they suggested, a couple of archaeologists, which shows how open-minded some of them can be, that the rock itself represented the ancestors, and their form was actually seen in the rock. And if you look at the rock, particularly on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, and in the middle, it does look like face shapes. And, you know, we can't be certain, but it seems to me entirely feasible, and I would agree with them, that the people who set up their home at the foot of this rock did think of this as a place of the ancestors, and did actually see the shapes of the ancestors' faces in the rocks themselves. And they may have told stories and tales about the ancestors. These have been lost because there's nothing written from the Neolithic or Bronze Age. But we know from other places, such as the Aborigines in Australia, that they saw shapes. They made stories up of creator and creatrix ancestors across the land. And to a stranger, it just looks like a rock or a sand hill or something. But to the Aborigines, these were places created in the dream time by the ancestors. And by walking the paths through the land, they would presumably tell the stories of the ancestors' creation. And those stories would be triggered by features actually in the land. And I can see something like that happening here at Roche Rock. The people who occupied the settlement at the bottom made offerings to the ancestors or the gods and goddesses, and told stories about them, and saw them in the rocks themselves. And as they walked the land, they too would tell their stories of the creation myths. This is Boswin's Men here, up on the moors near St Just, and it's been observed that from whatever angle you look at this standing stone, it's a different shape, and many people have seen a hooded crone figure actually in the rock itself. Independently, you know, these are not things that people have read about and gone to see. They've been themselves, and they've been struck by these shapes. This is Music Water up in North Cornwall, one of a number of sites, we talked about quartz earlier, which have a quartz built into them, or made of quartz. This one particularly is seen to have a human shape on the left-hand side, looking like a face. And, you know, as I said just now, if people today think it's that, people in the past must have done. This is Longstone on St Mary's on Yards of Scilly. Again, an archaeologist, Paul Ashby. Sometimes they step outside the box, and it's lovely to see. Thought there was a face in the top of this particular stone. And looking at it, to me, it looks like there's a very distinctive vulvar shape down near the bottom of the stone. This could have been an anthropomorphic stone. that were seen as a petrified human. And not only humans as well. I think to these people, animals are very sacred. Very often animals were told of in the stories when they were recorded. And I know they were recorded quite late. They were recorded in like the 7th, 8th, 12th century by Christian monks. But they were often recording things they didn't understand. So a lot of stuff comes through. And animals feature a lot in a lot of these myths, such as the Mabinogi in Wales and the Irish mythic cycles. One particular story, Arthur is chasing a pig, a sow, which was a sacred animal to the Celts, through Wales and down into Cornwall. And this one was one that we noticed up on Chapel Cambrai. This is one of the entrance graves on the side of Chapel Cambrai. And to me, when I looked at it closely after it was cleared some years ago, it's an unmistakable animal shape guarding the entrance grave. You can see its head and you can see its body. I don't think it's coincidence. I think the people who built the entrance grave chose that piece of rock deliberately as a guardian animal, if you like, of the dead in the entrance grave. Sites have also been seen at places like St Michael's Mount, and St Michael's Mount also has a lot of legends. There's a couple of legends at Michael's Mount. There's one of Cormoran and Chameleon, who were two giants, and their names are interesting because Andy Norfolk, as Cornish speaker, has suggested that Cormoran means blackberry giant and Chameleon means clover giant, and so they may be based on very old god and goddess, because the story about them is that they were flinging rocks from one high spot to another between St Michael's Mount and Trencrom Hill, where we met Tregovan, and one of the rocks was misplaced and struck Chameleon, and she is buried at the Greenstone Rock on the causeway across to St Michael's Mount. There are other stories of giants in the Cornish landscape. Cornwall is particularly known for its legends of giants, and there are lots of them. There's the legend of Bolster at St Agnes, and St Agnes tricks him into letting his blood flow out into a cleft in the rock. What he doesn't know, what she knows, is that it has no bottom to it. And so she's trying to get rid of him because he's pursuing her, and drains all his blood away, and he perishes. Again, nice story. Well, not nice. A very nasty story, actually. But, you know, what lies beneath it? Is there some memory of some kind of blood sacrifice here that was being done to do with the giants? A lot of these giant stories aren't just quaint stories. They're stories that have meaning and significance. Nearby to St Agnes, there was a giant at a place called Roth's Cove. Now, Roth is a Cornish word which means witch. So again, you've got to look not only at the archaeology and the anthropology, but also at the meanings of some of the words, because encapsulated into those meanings may be some memories of how these sites were originally used. One such story is of a giantess who had an apron full of stones, and she wandered over the land throwing out stones out of her apron, and from those stones were built the cairns and the natural rock tors, and also the man-made barrows which littered the Cornish landscape. So these stories of the giantess' apron are known throughout other Celtic lands. There's a site in Wales called Bacloriad y Gawys, which means the giantess's apron in ancient Welsh, and the same story applies there. in Ireland, at Loch Crew, at Cairn, there's a sort of shelf seat outside the cairn on the hill, and the legend there is the giantess again goes across the land and has thrown out the stones to make a cairn tea, and its seat is called the giantess's seat. So this giantess's apron motif, I think, is very ancient, and is actually a memory of a creation myth involving a supernatural being, a goddess, who created the land through the placing of rocks and stones and features actually in the land. So a lot of these stories are worth probing a little bit under and seeing what lies beneath. This notion of walking across the land and telling stories of the other world and the ancestors can actually be traced and recreated in the land itself. And to finish off with, I'm just going to look at one of these. And this is a story which is based on features actually in the land. Now, the alignment of sites in the land was researched by John Michel in the 1960s and 70s. And he discovered that a lot of these sites across the Penwith and Cornish landscape, his book was called The Old Stones of Land's End, are actually in a direct line, and you can walk that line. And they're contemporary sites, they date from roughly the same period. And you can walk across the land, and he believed that people walked across the land from one site to another, telling these stories about the other world. This particular one starts at Tracy Stone Circle. You can follow it across the land to Boswell's Men here, which is just on the horizon. It's visible from the Stone Circle. It then goes on to West Lanyon Coit in a straight line across the land. And some of this work, when John was down here, I had the privilege of sharing it with him. We used to go out and walk some of these lines across the land. And he wasn't much of an observer of boundaries. He just used to plough his way across the land, without asking permission. Probably couldn't get away with it nowadays. And after West Lanyon Coit, you come to Mulford settlement. But between West Lanyon Coit and Mulford settlement, we were walking in this straight line across the land. We came to a hedge, and blow me, at the exact point where we were following the land, in the hedge was a standing stone that had not been recorded before, but was actually in the hedge marking the line across the land. And much of this particular alignment can also be found in a story. Now, these stories were named by Andy Norfolk as song lines after some of the stories found by the Australian Aborigines. Similar idea of telling stories as you walked across the land. And I'll just read you this one of P. Tregear, because it's quite an interesting one, that follows the land and some of the natural energy lines that seem to run across the line. One of the best candidates for this is the tale of Anne P. Tregear, which takes place on All Hallows Eve, which we're coming up to. That is the old Celtic festival of Samhain, when the doors to the other world are opened. This could be a song line type story because it is so precise about the route P took home to Pendine from Penzance after she had placed some kind of psychotropic substance on her eyes. It says in the story that, quotes, she didn't go via Pol Tegan, Bottom and Boswednan, though it's the nearest. Instead, she took a course through Castle Horneck Fields. These routes can still be placed on the map today. The direct route through Boswednan is still a pathway today, running parallel to the A3071 road. to St Just, while the path she took through Castle Horneck runs northwestwards towards Madron. Part of this is an old churchway route used for travelling to churches and taking coffins to be buried. So a lot of this stuff may have gone into practice and folklore even in recent times. Paul Devereux has suggested alignments of ancient sites were really related to shamanic practices, and that this idea survives in Europe as death roads, corpse paths and churchways. He identified one such route running from Penzance Church, northwest through Madron and Lanyon Coit, and this may well have been the route that P takes, while under the influence of the psychotropic substance. She has a number of strange experiences along the way, including mistaking the gorse bush for a horseback rider, before ending up in a bog at Basallo. Here in her altered state of consciousness, she sees some piskies threshing the corn, who, once they become aware of her, vanish. These piskies are no twee, Edwardian gossamer winged creatures, but much more earthly nature spirits. Indeed, the principal thresher's face is described as being like great round owl's eyes, his body having naked arms and legs out of all proportion, and his feet splayed like a quilting or a frog. She then makes her way up to Dry Carn, and thence passes quickly over the road near Carncannajack and down the Gump, a place described as a haunted track that everyone dreaded. Bottrell says, "Few go near that wish place, about the turn of night, without hearing, if not seeing, the Old One and his hounds hunting among the rocks for any restless spirits that may have strayed on far from the churchyard or some other frightful apparitions, fighting and howling round the Carn or fleeing over the downs." It seems that P has continued to take a ghost road, that is one where the other world and the spirits of the dead manifest. This may be a very ancient track indeed, one that the prehistoric people walked, telling stories of the spirit world long before the modern roads were built. Anne P is now near home in Pendeen, but before she can get there she has a vision of a feaston market, a festival where fairies are dancing around a maypole. This is obviously a Beltane or May Day festival, another magical time when the doorway to the other world is opened. During this festival, she sees one of the little people drinking out of a poppy-shaped goblet, which reinforces the idea that all of this is taking place while under the influence of some mind-bending substance. Because we know that poppy is a psychotropic substance. Eventually, the vision vanishes, but P has further troubles when the piskies set upon her and mislead her path, until she gives up and lies down to sleep, where she is found the next day by the squire at Pendeen. Her trip, in both senses of the word, has been along an ancient spirit path in an altered state of consciousness, one that may well have been walked by prehistoric people following the songlines of the land. So, really, we've come to the end of this kind of wild ride we've been on. But the theme running through it all is that the other world was always very close to these people. Close to the Neolithic people originally, close to the Bronze Age ancestors, close to the Iron Age people, close to the early Romano-Christian people, close to the people in medieval times, and close right up until almost the present day. A final story tells of Jenny Tregear, and her baby was swapped for a changeling child. A changeling child was a creature the fairies brought into this world in exchange for taking a human baby out. And Jenny Tregear is told in order to get her child back, she has to go to Carn Uniwell, which is this one, Chapel Uni. And so she follows a pathway across the land through Caerbran and through Chapel Carn Bray in order to get to Chapel Uni Well. And there she bathes the child in the water 3 times, takes it around the world 3 times, and she does this on the first 3 Wednesdays in May, and she gets her own child back. Again, this is a mythic route, a songline if you like, across the land. Again, it's connected to the spirits of the dead, who would originally have been thought of as walking these paths. Again, it's probably a very old story that was told by the people themselves as they walk the land. She goes through Chapel Cambrai, which is the first and last hill of Cornwall, and Chapel Cambrai is still honoured. It's organised by the Old Cornwall Society that on Midsummer Eve they hold a bonfire up there. And this custom's spreading because now the Cornwall Heritage Trusts do it on St Creed Beacon as well. Originally it was done right through Cornwall, so one fire would be a signal to the next one to light, to be the next one, right up through Cornwall. We live in a rational world, but a rational world that's built on a world of knowledge of the other world, of connection to the other world, and a place where the other world was all around us all the time. We still live in a magical world. Thank you.
Was there like a queen of the other world or a matriarch, or because I know they had a king of the other world in, you know, is it in Welsh mythology where they have King Arwen? Is there like an alternative in like a queen of the?
Yeah. The problem for us here in Cornwall is twofold. One is nothing was written down and recorded in the Neolithic or Bronze Age. The earliest writing comes from the Iron Age, and the legends and stories were not written down in Ireland until the 7th or 8th century, in Wales to the 12th or 13th century. So we have, what we have is filtered through the monks that wrote the stories down, and so we have very little original material. What we have to do is take that material when it was written, and in Cornwall it was never written down until the 17th, 18th centuries, I think even later. What we have to do is take that early mythic material and look at what it may originally have said before the monks wrote it down. For instance, in the Welsh Mabinogi, there are lots of stories of queens and tribal leaders and powerful women. Now, to my mind, those stories were originally about goddesses, and they've been metamorphosed into queens and adventurers and so on in the Mabinogi. And what I tried to do in Between the Realms, which I don't think had been done before, was to look at the Cornish material, that even though it's so late written down, which may contain figures which are similar to that written in the Welsh and Irish material, and may in fact go back to a world where women were the queens and the spiritual deity was a goddess. Now that's all inference, because we've got nothing written. Yet it seems to me that the Cornish tales would not have been that different to the Irish and Welsh ones. They all share the same mythology, they share the same language. Although we don't have a figure that we can name in Cornish mythology and storytelling, yet I believe they would have had figures similar to some of the known and named figures in Welsh and Irish mythology. For instance, the goddess originally, and then the Saint Bridget appears a lot in these early stories. Knowledge of Bridget would have been brought here possibly by Irish immigrants. we do have a bridge as well, for instance, in Landu in North Cornwall. Other figures like Bladaiweth, which comes out of the Mabinogi, we would have had as part of our storytelling as well. Figures like Rhiannon, the horse goddess. Now, Cornwall is known for its horse goddess mythology. We have Pastos, Obios, and other places as well. I think they would have originally been dedicated to Rhiannon as a horse goddess, and so on. There are other examples at the festival of Lammas or Lunasa. There's a lot of tradition in Ireland about this being Lu, the god's festival. The festival is named after Lu, Lunasa, or under Christianity it's known as Lammas. But not only in Ireland, we also have an example in Cornwall at Morva, where there was a fair at that time. And when you go back into Irish legend, you find that the festival was set up by Lu for his foster mother, Tautu. Tautu isn't generally as well known as Lu, but it is Tautu's festival, it's not Lu's festival. And Tautu is a really interesting figure because she comes down from the high hilltops and she clears the forests and she gives the gift of bread making to the people. And that's where the human race gets its knowledge of harvesting and making bread. And I think this is a very ancient myth, because it's a creation myth. It's the goddess who comes and gives the knowledge and the gift of bread making to humankind. Although we don't have so much in Cornwall, and we don't have much written material, at least not about how to, in Cornwall, yet we too have a festival, Lammas Festival, which is turned into more of a fasty day nowadays. So there are things there, there are hints. There's nothing direct in Cornwall because stuff was written down so late, but I think the more we do this, the more we look at the legends, the more we look at the festivals, we find links to these other Celtic countries, and behind these other Celtic country stories are a lot of very early Neolithic and Bronze Age stories of gods and goddesses and our ancestors. It's work to be done. I've done some of it, but I'm sure you can find some more. If you do, let me know. Because I think there's a lot more work to be done to pick out the threads of this very early stuff. Okay, anybody else?
Cheryl, can I ask about did you say there was a goddess particularly linked to Trencron? And what was her name?
It was a giant.
Oh,
it was called Tregobin.
Yeah. Right.
And he's the one that's linked to Trencron.
Okay.
And he threw rocks across to the giant of Michael's Mount, Cormoran. And Cormoran's wife, Cormelian, gets hit in the head and dies. And again, it's an interesting story. Why would these giants be throwing rocks across the land to each other? Is this some memory of creating energy lines across the land? Because there's definitely one running between Trencron and St Michael's Mount.
Yeah.
So again, you know, they seem to be quaint stories, but they're not. They're actually about something a lot deeper. It's these stories of giants throwing quoits and rocks. Are they something to do about creating sacred sites in the land? You know, I think it's always good to look under the surface and see what more the stories could be telling us. Okay?
Quick question. So it's not really necessarily a fascinatingly mythical or anything like that. I was wondering, when we look at the pictures of the standing stones and such, and obviously they're about bare fields, should we be imagining them in clearings in woods, or is that is the context in which they are now similar to when they would have been observed and beheld back then?
Interesting question. As far as we can tell by environmental studies, Cornwall was far more wooded back in the Neolithic and Bronze Age. And it's been rightly suggested that if we're talking about alignments to the sun and the moon and the hilltops, people wouldn't have been able to see them because they would have been plonked in the middle of a wood or a forest. But it's also very recently been shown, and it's very recent research, that sight lines were cut through from the standing stones and other monuments and circles, so that people wouldn't have had a complete view, but what they would have had was a directed, specific view to things. So the cut-throughs may not simply have been tracks to reach the stones, they may have actually been sight lines to the sun and the moon or the hilltops if there was a giant figure or a goddess figure in the hill. They would have focused people's minds much more on that. And nowadays we wander around and these sites are in open places. And we have to really put ourselves back into the mindset of the Neolithic and Bronze Age people that built them, who may have built them with very specific sight lines in mind. So, yeah, the short answer is they probably wouldn't have been in open fields. They would have been in clearings in woods, because there were a lot more woods before we cut them all down. Okay? Right, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Kelly?